Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're now approaching the end of our discussion of the colonial era. We just have a few more things to talk about before we bring ourselves up to the brink of the American Revolution. When I first began talking about the colonial period, I mentioned that we were going to cover a period that took us from really disorganized colonies on the brink of desperation and death in the earliest years to colonies that were actually very well organized and prepared to launch a revolution against the most powerful imperial force in the world, Great Britain. So in these last couple of lectures in this chapter, we're going to talk about the tail end of that period as the colonies do in fact find themselves getting better organized and prepared for what became the revolution. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on the expansion of the British colonies and the brink of the French and Indian War. Throughout the early to mid-1700s, the British colonies were certainly growing. A number of cities had grown to impressive size. The largest city in the colonies in 1760 was Philadelphia, which boasted 23,000 residents. Other cities like Boston and New York were growing as well, and some larger towns like Albany, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and Baltimore, Maryland grew to impressive size. Just by way of context, though, even the largest cities in the British colonies paled next to some of the other big cities in the Atlantic world at that time. London, for instance, in 1760 had a population of about 700,000, and Mexico City about 100,000. So compare that to the largest city in the British colonies, Philadelphia, only 23,000. At the same time, we were beginning to see a greater disparity of wealth in the colonies as well. Remember, in the early years of the colonies, I talked about how almost everyone was struggling. There was a lot of poverty. Even some of the gentry that came over really struggled early on. But by this era, the kind of height of the colonial period, you were starting to see an elite wealthy class rising to the top and an ever-growing impoverished class at the bottom of society. We're also beginning to see in this era a scarcity of land as the cities themselves grew and started to consume more and more land, but also as more and more settlers kind of settled in the countryside and established farms. It was harder and harder to find land during this period. This is going to become an issue moving forward that we're going to discuss momentarily. But colonists in search of land had to kind of stretch farther and farther out from the centers that they had become accustomed to. So by the mid-1700s, the British began finding themselves more and more in conflict with the other continental powers, most notably the French, but also the Spanish as well. So just to compare a little bit between the British North American colonies and the French North American colonies, known as New France, the British colonies had a much larger population by the mid-1700s, about 1.2 million people, while New France had a population of less than 100,000. And if you recall some of the early discussion about the nature of these colonies, these disparity in numbers make sense. The French were kind of scattered, actually scattered really all across the middle part of the continent, all the way from New Orleans and along the Mississippi River up through the Ohio River Valley in what is today the Midwest and on into Canada. So you take those 100,000 or so citizens and scatter them across many hundreds of miles. We can also contrast the two powers in terms of their relations with the Indians. And again, if you think back to my early discussion of the nature of French settlement, most of them were fur traders or others who lived out in the wilderness, kind of in close proximity to the Indians. They didn't have the benefit of large numbers, and so there were much better relations in general between the French and the Indians than there were between the British and the Indians, whose attitude was more along the lines of driving them off the land. And the Indians that had confronted the British along the coast were also devastated by disease really throughout this period. It's estimated that more than 2 million Indians lived east of the Mississippi River in 1600, and that number was less than 250,000 by 1700. So in that century, about 90% of the Indians were wiped out by disease. And so this kind of leads us to a discussion of what some scholars have described as the middle ground, the region between New France and the British colonies, which was largely controlled by Indians, with both sides kind of negotiating with the Indians and trying to establish a foothold in that middle ground. But certainly by the end of this era, we start to see the British colonies and the phenomenon I discussed on the previous slide, the growth of the cities, the scarcity of land. The British colonies and settlements begin expanding out to the west and starting to reach the Appalachian Mountains, starting to kind of threaten the Great Lakes area and the Midwest. And that's going to lead them into conflict with the French and the Indians. So this map gives you an idea of what I'm talking about here. It takes a look at the expansion of the British North American settlement. So these kind of lighter areas on the coast and on the eastern portion of North America were settled before 1760. And then the shaded regions in the middle. This is the period we're talking about, this era of conflict that the British are starting to push into in the 1760s. And then you see them sort of crossing the Appalachians or starting to cross the Appalachian Mountains by the 1770s. But that's the period that we're talking about. They're going to start bumping up against New France in the middle, and there's going to be conflict in that region. So in the mid-1700s, there were a series of wars between the great powers of Europe. And actually, France and Britain were at war for the better part of a century over in Europe. And those wars began to spill over into North America. There were a number of different clashes between Spain and England, and then France and England. And again, those carried over into North America. The most important of these was King George's War from 1744 to 1748, in which the French won a resounding victory. And in the aftermath of that victory, they set up a line of forts in the Ohio country with the intention of limiting English expansion to the west. Not so much in retaliation of this, but kind of around the same period. In 1749, the governor of Virginia, whose name was Dinwiddie, organized the Ohio Company of Land Speculators, of which one was, at that time, a young man named George Washington with great ambitions. And so these land speculators from Virginia are kind of making their way out into the countryside, and eventually they start launching kind of exploratory missions out into that newly captured French territory. This is ultimately going to lead to the conflict that kind of erupts into the French and Indian War, which we're going to talk about more fully in the next lecture. But we're going to talk about some of the early kind of skirmishes now. In 1754, the first battle of those skirmishes was fought at Fort Duquesne, which is on the site that is now Pittsburgh at the confluence of the three rivers. And George Washington actually led that first attack in 1754, which was a disastrous attack for the British forces led by Washington. They were routed by the French and their Indian allies, and Washington was lucky to escape with his life. This is kind of the first skirmish that is ultimately going to break out into full war in the French and Indian War. At around that same time, in Albany, New York, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Hutchinson organized the first real conference or congress bringing together all of the British colonies. In fact, only 7 of the 13 colonies were represented at this Albany Conference or the Albany Congress, but it's a really important step in signaling to the colonies that there were going to be efforts at organizing them and uniting them. And so some of the things that were discussed at this Albany Conference were the regulation of commerce among the colonies, the requirement of some sort of national defense, even though, of course, at that time they're not a nation yet, but kind of combining them together. There was discussion of creating one general government of America that would be headed by a grand council with representatives of the people, which would be appointed by the king. So I want to just emphasize here that these are still British colonies, and this was an effort to unify as British subjects. But this is the first time that we really see representatives from the disparate colonies coming together and start talking about, kind of combining their forces as one. At that time, not much really came out of the Albany Conference. We don't leave there with the colonies organized as one, but the germ of the idea is planted, and of course, within not too many years, we are going to be talking about the colonies all uniting. So by 1755, the British government has decided the time is ripe to launch another attack against Fort Duquesne. They sent a force under General Edward Braddock, who led his men, including George Washington, through the thick forest on their way to Fort Duquesne, hacking their way through the woods, making progress of only a few miles a day. As they neared the fort, they were surprised by the entire French force along with their Indian allies. Now understand, at that point, we're still talking about relatively small forces, a few hundred French and 600 or so Indians, and perhaps twice that number in terms of English and colonial troops. So there's only a few thousand in the field all at the same time. But this was one of the first battles where the traditional kind of English style of warfare really ran into trouble here in North America. They were fighting in relatively close quarters in the woods. The Native American troops in particular were very skilled at hiding in the woods and then jumping out and launching these kind of surprise attacks. And so the British forces are just kind of shredded in this battle. George Washington's coat was pierced 4 times by bullets. 2 different horses were shot out from beneath him, and he's lucky to escape with his life. This is the first real battle of what becomes the French and Indian War, which we're going to talk about more fully in the next lecture.